Hello and welcome. My name is Owen McCubbin. I am a character technical artist and animator at a game studio in Colorado by the name of Serenity Forge. I have been doing character rigging and technical art throughout all of my educational and professional careers. I've even been doing Kinefx and learning and working with Kinefx since its early introduction in Houdini 18.5. In fact, I was lucky enough to be one of the early teachers of Kinefx as I was working at SideFX in their education and training department, teaching Kinefx and its new tool set to professors and visual effects artists in the industry as it was coming out. I'm very excited to be teaching this course for you today. We will be covering everything in Kinefx from initial skeleton creation to orientation and capturing of meshes to animation, even hand animation and retargeted animation, creating control systems for our rigs, and creating a nice big scene. We'll also be exploring the differences between some organic rigging methods and some more mechanical rigging methods, as we will be not only rigging this humanoid character, but also a mechanical spacecraft. I'm excited to be teaching this course, and I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome. What is Kinefx? Let's talk about Kinefx real quick. Kinefx is a very similar system to other DCC's rigging packages like Maya's joint chain systems or Blender's bone structure. It is a new development since Houdini 18.5 that is far different from Houdini's old method of rigging, which was with object level bones. Kinefx uses simple points, such as this point here that we can see thanks to some Kinefx tools, to manipulate the mesh through Houdini's capture weights. In this way, it's very similar to joint chain structures in Maya, but we have all the natural and useful tools that Houdini has to offer on its geometry level. The other difference between Houdini's old system of bones at the object level, which you can still make, these bones, which consisted of 2 points and a primitive, and its new Kinefx systems, is that Kinefx is all located in the SOPs level, which lets us have the option and tools for all sorts of things that we can manipulate geometry with, from the add SOP to resample to all the tools that we find useful in SOPs. The unique thing about the joints, these points that make up our joints for Houdini, is, as we can see, they have a name, and if we just pop down a skeleton to just start making our own new chain here, and we just make a simple one bone real quick, we can see that the unique aspects of this singular point and the attributes we need for the Kinefx system is we need a local transform matrix, a 4x4 matrix for local transform. We also need a 9x9 world transform, and we need a name. The skeleton SOP is what we will be using a good amount to make custom joints and custom skeleton chains, joint chains, for our character. Throughout this course, I'll be using that cyborg character we just saw, and it's a free download, and we will point all students in the direction of being able to get this resource and follow along with me. But let's continue talking about Kinefx's joints. There are several ways we can create joints in Houdini. As I said, the main important parts of joints are simply that we have our local transform, a name, and a transform attributes. You can make this in a number of ways. The skeleton SOP does things for us. We can create joints in very free-form ways, and it creates our nice parented structure in the ways that we want to, and it's very interactive. We can rename our joints up here or with the rig tree, as we can see here. And we can change and edit the skeleton change, or the skeleton chain, however we want to with this skeleton SOP. But if you're going for a more procedural approach or procedural project, you can create a skeleton by any other method that you'd like to, creating attributes. One useful node that we can use that's provided with the Kinefx package is if we just have a line and we give it a bunch of points, and we want to create all these points into joints. Right now, they don't have the needed attributes. We can create attributes with a wrangle if we wanted to, if you're comfortable with Vex, or a simple way and a quick fast way is using the rig doctor node. The rig doctor node can allow us to initialize our missing names, and it can give us our missing transforms if we need so as well. And as we can see, now we have our local transform matrix, and we have our name. And we can see that now all of these points have become that kind of white point, that joint indication. You can also give your points names using the name SOP if you'd rather. That'll give you your name attribute. Or like I said, we can use wrangles just like the rig doctor node does to give it transforms and its local vector4 matrix. But the most common ways to get the joints that you need with the correct attributes are using the rig doctor or creating skeleton chains with the skeleton. So those are the importances of points and joints and the attributes needed to create skeletons in Houdini. The final most important concept of Kinefx to need to know before we get started exploring the rest of the world of Kinefx, including constraints and kinematics and all sorts of other solutions, is the rig pose node. This is possibly the most important node, second to that of the bone deform, in Houdini. Or I would even put it ahead of the bone deform actually. Bone deform just lets us see our changed mesh. But in order to change our mesh, in order to change our skeleton, we need a rig pose node, which will allow us to select joints and manipulate them by hand, or you can input any amount of H script or expressions into the attributes, into the transform matrix of each of these joints. These are the most important concepts to know before entering into the world of Kinefx. So now that we know the kind of importance of the attributes needed for joint points and how to manipulate them with the rig pose, at least by hand, something important to note for Kinefx is since our joint chains, no matter if it's built with the skeleton SOP or a line SOP and then given proper attributes and whatnot, it is just geometry, no matter how you make it. So you can manipulate it however you want to, with Vex, WOPs, any way you want to manipulate the geometry of a skeleton, you can do so. The rig pose is the most important for animation purposes and is the main SOP that we will be using for manipulating our character rigs. It is the most similar sort of interaction that we can get in Houdini as we get in other DCCs. Alright, so we now know the importance of the attributes needed to create some joints in Houdini, and we also know that the rig pose node will help us pose that skeleton when we have it created. Now let's explore a kind of basic pipeline of how we can start to manipulate a mesh. So let's start by just making a simple tube here. We want it to make sure it's polygon. I'm going to move it up to 0.5 so it's flush with the ground, and just make its radius just a little bit less so it's a skinnier tube, and make it have some subdivisions, some rings on it. Now you can choose to create a skeleton however you want to, but I want to explore some functions of the skeleton SOP. So firstly, when we enter the skeleton SOP, our joint placement will be view based. And what that means is when we have a mesh templated or viewed, and we click with our skeleton interactively, it will utilize that mesh and try and create a tracer through that mesh and do its best to place in the middle of that mesh, so from one end to the other end. So here we can see it does a pretty good job of placing that joint in the center. It's not perfect, as we can see, but it does a really good job, especially since I clicked off to the side. So there we can see from the camera base it was projecting kind of a line like that, and we got right in between those two meshes. So that is the view-based creation. Freehand is another one we'll use throughout this course, which is just kind of creating a skeleton and it not being affected by the mesh whatsoever. And then surface-based will do its best to place the joints on the surface that we have templated or viewed, as we can see. All very helpful when creating a skeleton. If we want to edit the skeleton, a way we can stop building off of a chain is by middle mouse clicking, and we'll see that we're no longer building off of it. We can then go back and click on any of the other joints and build branches off of it. And if we want to edit the placement of joints, we can go up here and change it from create to modify. By default, we won't be able to change the position of the joints. We'll just be able to change the name. If we want to be able to change the position, we can turn on tweak mode, and we can click and drag our point around. Also still based off of kind of our joint placement method. So with surface activated, we were pretty well snapping to surface, but now since we've gotten it off the surface, it's kind of not doing so well. But we can manipulate joints this way. And say we wanted to manipulate a parent joint, but didn't want to manipulate its children joints, as we can see here. We can turn on child compensate, and this will allow us to just alter the one joint we want to as we go through this, as we modify our skeleton. By pressing the P button, we'll bring up this window, and we can see more in-depth information on the point itself. We can see its transform, and we can edit these values by hand if we want to. Local transform, and its name, and we can change all the information we need to inside this window. Now let's start creating a new skeleton for this tube that we will be able to skin the tube to and manipulate. So I'm just going to make a new skeleton node to start, just as a simple, nice, fresh slate. We'll go into create mode, and I'm going to click press space B to enter our 4 window view, and I'm going to create on the side view. I like the view-based creation method since it kind of gets it in the middle of the mesh as best as possible, but since we're looking at it from a side view as well, we can do freeform and it'll be in the exact middle of the mesh as well. I'm going to create a skeleton with a slight bend in it for ease of kinematic solving later, and I'm going to come in and rename all these joints. So I'm going to call this one tip, and we'll call this one mid, and this one base. Now, a useful tab that we can use when creating skeletons as well is this rig tree node, or this rig tree tab. We can find it by creating a new pane tab and going under animation and finding it here, rig tree. We can see that we get a breakdown, kind of like a scene breakdown of how things are parented, but simply with the skeleton. Here we can also rename our joints if we need to, or select them. Now let's go through the process of creating skin weights. So a nice way that Houdini creates skin weights is by using its biharmonic system, which is what Houdini used when using the bone system. To do so, we are going to need to grab some, as we can see when we look up bone capture, we get bone capture biharmonics, or biharmonic. We need the skin geometry and the capture geometry. Okay, let's go through the process of skinning this mesh. The common method for organic skinning in Houdini is called the biharmonic method, where we use a tet embed mode and a biharmonic capture, which we can find by simply searching biharmonic. We can see this bone capture biharmonic. It's very good at doing organic structures, and it's what we will use for our humanoid character. There's another form of mesh capture that is better for kind of mechanical things that we will also be using at a later date. If we look up capture here, we can find it in this list, capture pack geometry. But we will explore that further later when we go and do a rig for a mechanical structure. The biharmonic capture system needs a few things. We need a skin geometry and a capture geometry. The capture geometry is created by using a tet embed node. The tet embed node needs some input polymeshes, and we need some points and curves. The points and curves that we need are created by a bone capture lines node as such. So from our skeleton we feed into our bone capture lines. Our bone capture lines goes into our additional points and curves of our tet embed. Our polygon mesh that we need for the tet embed is our mesh itself that we're skinning. Our skin geometry for our capture is our skinned mesh, and our capture geometry is our tet embed geometry. And then we can place down a bone deform node, and our output of our biharmonic capture is going to be a skinned mesh with capture data that can go into our geometry input. Our rest points can come directly from our skeleton, and for the time being our animated deform point transforms can also come from our skeleton. Just to make it separate, if we need to, we can add in a rig pose node here so that we can differentiate that this is our animation slash deform joint chain and this is our rest chain, simply straight from our created skeleton. If we take a look at the tet embed mesh, if you've never explored this node before, if we turn on wireframe, we can see that this mesh is very dense. It becomes very dense. And essentially what our system is doing here, if we look at our capture lines as well, it's basically a nice resample of our bone capture lines from our joints. from our chains here, from our primitives. We can see that it's subdivided a lot, and we have a lot of extra points here. And when we look at our tet embed, we can see a focus of points kind of in that area. What our system does here with the biharmonic bone capture system does is it spreads an attribute, a capture attribute, out from our bone points along this very dense structure of points, like a spider web or a virus, out to the edge, which is determined from our skin mesh. And from that data we can determine the distance from the points that we need to weight our skeleton. And as we can see, when we enter into our, when we look at our bone deform, and we manipulate our skeleton, we can see its result. It does a pretty good job of maintaining volumes based on distance from the points. And this is why it's very good. We can see even just with this tube why it can maintain volumes well and is good for organic deformation. If we want to manipulate that capture data, we can put down a layer capture paint node, a capture layer paint node. And we can simply pipe in, can plug it in here, and we can see that data visually on the mesh just like we could in other DCC packages. We can change some parameters here to make our skin weight painting a bit easier. We can, instead of seeing all regions, we can see just selected regions, and you can change what kind of visual you have with the visualization mode. We can select different skeletons, different joints, with the control middle mouse button to see its skin weight region. You can do so with the bones, so the primitives in between the points, and it'll select the kind of parent of that bone, which will, in this case was the mid. And if we do so with the mid to base primitive, we'll get to see the base's skin weight region. As we can see, the skin weight data was kind of based on this primitive that spanned out from our skeletons, meaning that the tip didn't get much data at all, which is fine since it didn't really need much data for the deformation to look good. As we can see, when we bend it, it looks great. And we don't really need much data up here since there's not much point unless you as an animator or character rigger want some skin weight data up here. So quickly, let's go over a little bit more in depth the capture layer paint. So as we saw earlier, we can control middle mouse on any of our joints to see their capture weight region, and we can change how that information is displayed to us. However, how do we actually change the data? Well, we can right click on our viewport here, and we can see the different operations. Left mouse button does a true paint, middle mouse button does a smooth final. I'm going to change middle mouse button to be reduce, since shift clicking is a smooth final already to begin with. I'm going to select this top joint, and I'm just going to left click, and we can start to see that that adds weight towards red, which we're in infrared mode right now, which means red is heavy weight. We can adjust how hard we are painting up here with our depth and opacity. Opacity reduced will make it apply slower, and if we increase it, we will see immediate fast painting. Now that we have our simple tube rig, let's start exploring a typical pipeline to Kinefect's kind of thought processes and procedures. And we're going to do this through creating a simple kinematics. So I've gone ahead and actually switched over the rig to be just a line so that I have more points to deal with when showing this process. So let's start by, well, putting down a IK solver, IK chains node, which is how we're going to create our IK for the time being. We'll notice when we put down the IK chains node that there are two inputs needed. We have the skeleton and the IK drivers. This kind of introduces the idea behind taking points from our skeleton and creating controls for them, which is what a process we'll see as we approach a lot of this course. We'll take points from our skeleton, just up here, and we will extract them, the ones that we need to for any control that we might want, and then we'll repipe them into our skeleton with a blend or with something like this IK chains, which we'll notice if we add an IK chain to, it has a blend. And we're going to use those extracted points to control our main chain. This is kind of a far different thought process than what we would see in something like Maya, where we would just have our one joint chain structure, and in order to create controls for it, we'd position nodes at the same points as those joints and then constrain those joints to our controls. In this process with Kinefects, we're actually using the joints, which are just points in Houdini, as controls themselves. And we'll see later when we actually hook up control geometry, we're really just extending where we can grab that point from. So let's get started. So for a kinematic solver for this IK chain, we need a root, mid, and tip. And for just a quick explanation on what a IK is, it's inverse kinematics. Think of like a leg, where when you place down your foot and you bend from your hips, your foot stays on the ground, and your hips follow it, rather than something like forward kinematics, which is where you move your arm, you move from your shoulder to your elbow to your wrist. So it's the end of the chain is controlling where the rest of the chain of joints is. And for that, we just need these 3 points, but as we can see, we have too many points for just 3. So we can extract a few points by using a delete joints node if we want, and we can use this to just select the joints we need. So we need an end, a mid, and a base. I'm just going to select those points that are roughly in the middle of those positions. And when we select our delete joints, we can see that all those joints that we just selected were deleted, and just like a regular blast or delete node in Houdini, we can switch it over to delete non-selected. And there we go. We can see now that we have a different chain of joints that if we hook up a rig pose to, has only those 3 joints, and the parent structure is still maintained from our original line of joints. We'll also probably not need this rig pose anymore, because as we notice, if we edit this before we separate out our controls geometry, we're effectively changing kind of the rest geometry, but in a way. Our rest is plugged into a different spot, but we don't really want to change our joint chain before extracting our control points in this case. So I'm just going to pass by that node just so we don't use it anymore. But we will notice that we have these 2 chains, as we stated earlier, as we set up earlier when we were doing skin weighting. We have this rest chain that comes directly from our skeleton and into our bone deform, as you can see here, rest point transforms. And we also have these deform point transforms. So anytime we want to adjust the animation of our skeleton, we're always going to edit the deform side of things. We don't want to affect our rest skeleton, our rest pose, once it's created. You can of course go back and change the rest pose if need be for skin weighting or any other reason. Just when animating, we don't want to affect the rest pose. So we have our 3 points here. Now let's go into making our kinematic solver. So we require a skeleton, and we require our IK drivers. So we have our 3 IK drivers here. However, they're parented right now. So if we move our base joint, we'll move all of our IK controls. And this doesn't really help us when we want to do an IK system where maybe we just want to change the tip around, or we want to change its twist orientation joint, which will become our third or our mid joint here, without affecting the tip joint. So we can put down a reparent node, or sorry, just a parent node. And we can select node or joints interactively if we want to change how the parent structure is created, or we can add selections in here, select our joints. So for this one, I'm going to select all of our joints, and we'll just keep the parent blank so that they become unparented. Now we can edit each of the joints without affecting any of the other joints, and we can just put this right before our rig pose node, just like that. Super nice that we get that procedural aspect of Houdini with this rigging system, rather than, say, in Maya, we would have had to unskin this whole chain of things or do a whole bunch of other stuff that we couldn't just reposition where we did our unparent and reparent. So we have our IK chains now. We might want to get in the practice of offsetting our twist joint. So we can call this rig pose offset twist, just so that there's this triangular shape from our joints, so that we have a direction, a normal direction that is away from this straight line for our kinematics, our IK, to solve from, so it knows which direction to bend our line of joints here. So we'll put that into our IK drivers, and our skeleton is just our regular skeleton at the point of before separating out our control joints. So you could have edited the animation in this case if you wanted to, and then separate out the kinematics, and you can still extract it from there. Or if there was this rig pose that we were just saying, alright, I want to move the whole joints here like that, then you could build your kinematics off of this point. But like I said, I'm just going to skip over that for the time being. So we have our rest skeleton now, and our separated out controls. And this one I'm going to maintain with just being offset. So I'm going to put down a new rig pose as well to be our IK control. IK animate. And for readability, if you want, you can put down nulls just to say IK control out, or however you want to organize your scene for readability. Once we have our IK chain hooked up and ready, we can start to select our joints. So our root node is going to be, or our root joint is going to be the base of our skeleton line here. Our mid one is going to be the middle joint that we extracted earlier, and our tip is going to be our very tip. Now, since each of our joints have a name attribute, if our points were extracted as such, we can simply match our twist and goal joints by name, and we no longer have to determine them by hand or by inputting a name. Of course, since we're able to select the control points we need, if for some reason we had a different chain of IK control joints somewhere, you could of course plug that into the IK drivers and select those control points here instead, and then you would want to match your twist and your goal name by selecting the proper controls. So our IK is pretty much set up now, and if we were to put it into our animation line and start to edit our control points here, we should start to see some deformation for IK solving. As we can see, that twist joint that we set up earlier, that midpoint offset twist, it bends towards that twist joint. If it was perfectly in line, we'd start to get a random, rather not random, but unpredictable position as to where we were twisting our tube towards. So it's not towards Z positive as I would have wanted to control. So here we can just reset that to be forward. And of course, if we want to change where it twists to, once we have that offset, we can animate this twist joint to control where it twists. So we can predictably know where it'll start to bend, and then how we can control where it bends towards. Very nice. And here we can see that basic structure of extracting the joints that we need to create control geometry for our solving of what we need, whether it be FKs, IKs, spline IKs, any amount of control that we want. We can simply split it off from our main chain, delete what we need, delete what we want, set up our control system, and replug it into this main chain. And like I said, if we can see here that this blend is blending our positions from our extracted joints in with our main chain. We can see this when I edit this chain of things. It'll do its best to put these joints in line with our IKs, and the result, as we can see here, is this is the IK chain and it points towards, and we blend, we can put it back towards the main chain, so we can effectively turn off the IKs. If we had a special system of FKs or a reparented system of FKs, for instance, we can just take our delete joint node here, and if instead of wanting to set up a kinematics, we just wanted to set up a reverse FK system, we could do so. We could take that parent node that we had here, and instead of simply deleting all our parenting structure, we'd want to start with deleting our parenting structure, and then we can set up a new parent structure as such. And once we pose this with a rig pose, we now have that reverse structure, so we can pose from the top down instead. If we wanted to create that simple structure, we could put down our own skeleton blend node and blend in our controls. Right now we're blended towards our base chain, and we can blend towards our control chain. We'll notice something really wonky happened here, and it's because we aren't controlling, our control joints aren't in the same space or same structure as our main chain was. We reconstructed the parents, they now have new local transforms and that kind of stuff. So we'll want to make sure we're transforming in world space. And we can see here that the interpretation has blended the joints that we have, our root joint, or rather our tip joint, our mid joint, and our base joint were blended perfectly. And just with this strange reparent structure that we did here, we've dragged along the in-betweens from our tip and our base. So the reason we see our in-betweens between our tip and our midpoint is because we never changed the parent structure for these in-betweens. We can see that they're still following that midpoint if we put down a rig pose here, which is exactly how our main structure is supposed to operate. So of course when we blended back in just our 3 points with no extra interpretation for any of the other points, they are still children of that midpoint, so they'll follow with that joint, and our tip joint is what is blended with that. Basically this is to show that any sort of system of controls that you want to build from your main chain, you can just extract and start to build it out and blend it back in with your main chain to control it. So back to our IKs here. We now have an IK system set up, and we can see it working. And this is the general process we'll see as we approach a lot of solving for control systems with our Kinematic rigs, both with our organic cyborg rig and with our mechanical vehicle rig. Alright, now that we've explored a little bit of IK chains and extracting controls from our base skeleton, let's do a little bit more of a deep dive into Kinematics Solvers. There's 2 more that we can explore, well, kind of like 1.5, and we're going to explore them in the rig VOP. So we're starting to dive into a new VOP that was introduced with Kinematic, and a lot of new VOPs that are part of Kinematic. We'll notice we have 4 inputs, and similar to an IK chains over here, we want to input our rest / base skeleton that we want to affect into one of our inputs. Due to the nature of how VOPs work, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first input. I like to do it into the first input for organization, and any control geometry into second or latter points. We dive into our VOP. We can see that we have an interactive viewport here, where when we hover over each of our joints, we can see several versions of our joint pops up. If we click on one of our joints, just clicking, we can toggle between the different points, and when we click and drag on one of the points into our VOP Vex Builder, we can see that we get a get point transform from our top one there, and if we use a bottom one, we get a get transform, and our very bottom one is a set point transform. So you can think of these 3 points as our output, input from one of our inputs, and input from our other input. We can see here that our get point transform is just grabbing a point by name from our second input. And same thing goes for our point 1, it's by name and just by our first input. So by the nature of how we organize things, we can tell that this is our rest skeleton joint, and this is our control skeleton joint. So that's how we can grab points from Vex. So you can either place down your nodes by typing them in, get point transform, and determining it by hand, or you can interactively grab them from your scene. If we wanted to set up a Kinematic Solver in here, we can search Kinematics, IK Solver, and we can see that we get an IK Solver. Our IK Solver looks kind of similar to our IK Solver node on the SOP level. We can see that we have a root, a goal, and a twist, and we can see we have target points here. Our signature is basically how this information is presented to us. I'm just going to leave that as it is. So our target points are the points that we are affecting, and our control file points, as we can see, are being grabbed from the second input. Of course, if you've reorganized your inputs, you'll want to go in and change that. This is why I like to put the rest/affected skeleton into our first input and our control skeleton into our second input. So we can set up a kinematic solver in a very similar way here, and you can do it either by typing in your names or your point numbers rather, or you can connect them with your get point transforms. So our root is going to be this point 0, and this is our root there, and we can see we can hook it up as such if desired. We can see over here that our colors and titles don't really match up with our set point transform, and this is because our IK solver is setting multiple points. So we want to get set point transforms with a plural S, and then we can plug in our X form and our points there, and we can see that that has already started to affect our joint chain. It's naturally grabbing 0, 1, and 2 as our root, goal, and twist, which if we dive back up to our outputs here and we turn on our numbers, 0, 1, and 2 are all that we have. So it's naturally grabbing the correct numbers, just in the wrong order. Our goal is actually number 2, and our twist is actually number 1. And there we go, it's actually more properly affecting how we'd want that IK to be solved. And we can see that it's doing something different than our IK solver up top. It's creating this sort of arch rather than a proper solve. And let's investigate that. Firstly, we need to determine our orientation of our joints properly. Unlike our IK change, which kind of helps us do that automatically, we need to do it by hand. If we want to see our orientation, we can right click in the viewport and we can display joint axes. So negative Y is currently being used, but positive Y is what our base chain here uses. So we'll want to switch that over to positive Y as our look at, and we can see we are already getting a better solve for this. And our up axis, as we can see if we dive into our base chain here, our Z axis is actually pointing towards our twist joint, which is in this case the up axis, so we want to switch that over to Z as well. And there we go, we can start to see that the deformation is no longer doing any weird things. Our bended curve here is matching much better with our base line, and we can start to affect the IK solver however we wish to, with some nice additions here that aren't present on our SOP level of things. We can see though that this version of our solver is not taking into account the straight lines of our joints, and the reason for that is that we're not blending our joints like we did with our SOP. We're interpreting them based on just those 3 points there, our triangular system, our control joints. So there's a main difference between the 2 different solvers that we have here. We can adjust some parameters in here, like keeping a root transform if we want that base to kind of stay positioned upward. And we can just generally play around with how this IK solver is different than our other IK solver on the SOP level. In a way, you can think of this IK solver in our attribute VOP, kind of similar to that of a spline solver for something in like Maya, where we have a curve and we're affecting the curve, and that is how we are changing the IK instead of having a simple 3-chain structure. We can get this IK solver to act like our simple IK solver up here. With this parameter right here, use simple solver for 2 or 3 joints. If we turn that on, we can see that something immediately breaks, and that's because our target points are taking all of our points, which is 8 points or 9 points, which is more than 2 or 3 joints. If we determine our joints either by bringing them in and combining them, or if we just know the numbers, which I will just go take a look at here, we need 0, 4, and 8. Then we can dive back in and put those in, 0, 4, and 8. There we go. So we get a very similar deformation to our IK chain SOP, but we get the benefit of our VOP node, a little bit extra attributes here, such as our stretch, which is really just a 0 or 1 kind of thing. It's either on or off, which if we turn it on and we hop back up to our rig pose and start to manipulate our IK here, and we push it beyond where our joint can normally solve for, we start to get that nice stretch in the mesh. And we can do the same for the squash if desired as well. Squash doesn't seem to have as major of an effect, but we get those two added benefits, and if we turn that off, we can see that if we were using it like that kind of spline solve, we can have a lot more fun and sort of play around with the unique aspects of using this as the IK solver instead of the basic SOP solver. So that's diving into a little bit of the VOPs part of Kinefx. So we have this IK solver set up with our VOPs now, and we have this interesting sort of problem that we have where we can keep the root transform here, so we can keep the orientation of our input joint to keep that kind of flat. But what if we want to keep the orientation of our tip as well? Well, instead of just putting this directly into our deform chain, if we put into a skeleton blend, and we can see here the orientation we want that we are controlling with our control chain here, and we got that stretch going, but we want this orientation to be met with just the tip joint. We can kind of force it by using this skeleton blend. We can put in our control chain here and our new base chain here, and for this skeleton blend we just want to blend that tip, and we want it to blend towards our control joint in world space, since we have that difference in structure. And now when we plug that into our deformation and we check it out, we can see that that tip, especially if we just look at it in this orientation mode, is completely in line with how we had our control. Now, since we earlier were looking at the skin weights of the tip of this tube, it doesn't really affect much, but we can have that kind of control, which is useful later when we are setting something up like an arm, for instance, where we want to maintain that tip's orientation as well as the base orientation. Perfect. So we have explored the Solve IK VOP, and there's one more IK solver that we can explore, which is the Curve Solver, which is very, very similar to a spline solve spline IK in Maya or other DCCs, where we can take a number of target points and control points, which we're just going to continue using our IK controls and our regular chain, and we can instead plug these guys into our set point transforms. And we'll notice that we need to reorient our axes again to match our needs. So our Y up and Z positive. And we'll notice that our curve order currently is at 4, but our control points, we only have 3 of them. So there's a mismatch there, and if we just plop that down to 3, we can see that we build our Bezier curve, which we can change between polygon lines if we want, which gets kind of wonky for a curve solver. So Bezier curve or NURBS curve. I'm just going to leave it at Bezier curve, and we can come back up and see that deformation how we want it. We'll notice that our z-axis got flipped a little bit here, so we're just going to go back to z negative, and then we're in line with our base joint chain, which if we ever want to stop seeing our input joint chain and our output joint chains, we can right click in our viewport and we can uncheck display inputs, and then we'll only see the output. But I kind of like seeing the inputs. We get to see our control points and our baseline. Here we could play around with squash and stretch just like our other IK solver, except for the squash and stretch on the curve solver, in my opinion, works a bit better. As we can see here, that squash really comes through and that stretch is very nice as well. Of course, since this is a curve solver, if our points kind of collide and do this weird thing, we're making a very sharp curve there that's just based off of our line. So our mesh starts to deform kind of oddly. So it can get strange, just like any kinematics can get strange when we get our points too close to one another. So explore that if you want, and it's a pretty cool solution. I think we'll be using it a few times for our character for specific use cases. So this was a brief introduction to the curve solver. Let's move on to constraints. We'll be exploring the curve solver more later in the course, where we have some good use cases for our character rigging and some solutions there. Alright, before we go into exploring constraints and that whole world, let's actually cover real quick how we might be able to see some control geometry for our rig poses. So similar to our joint system here, where we have names for our joints, we need names for geometry that we can hook up into our points. So let's start by just making any geometry. I'm going to just start with a circle, as we can see here. I'm going to turn it into a NURBS curve, or even just a primitive. I'm going to close, or even still keep a polygon rather. I don't care. We're going to keep it, we're going to turn it open, so it's like similar to a NURBS curve that we would create, or a NURBS control that we would create in Maya. And we can put it flat with the ground. So we could put it on our, could just give it a rotation real quick of -90. So it's flat with the XZ plane. Then we're going to give it a name. And we'll just call it example control. And now we can hook it up using a geometry or a control. Oh, I've forgotten what it's called. Let's see real quick. It is a attach joint geo. There we go. My bad there. So we can input our target skeleton, and we want to do this before our rig poses. So we can just plop it in right there. It'll automatically hook up our target geometry, and we can hook in our geometry here into this shape library. Now if you have multiple different shapes that you want with multiple different names, you can simply use a merge node, combine them all together, and then hook them up here, so long as you just have their name determined before your merge. And even if you have like if you have a sphere and then a copy node for some reason to just create a lot of spheres, however you want to as such, and this is where you want to merge in your control, then this shape now becomes your control and you want to give it a name. So you can build any geometry that you want to and create controls out of it. We can even use the rubber toy if we want to, so long as we just give it a name. And we can start using it as a control geometry. As we can see here, if we add a assignment here and we select one of our joints that we want to assign to, we'll just select the tip. We can now see our shapes that we can choose from, our example control or our rubber toy. So if we use a rubber toy, it'll just put it right on top of that joint, and anytime we select our rubber toy on our rig poses in the future, we're now controlling the joint as with a giant rubber toy. Kind of ridiculous, yes, but if we use something more manageable, something more reasonable, like the example control that we built earlier, then we can select it way out here, and when we have our bone deform selected, we don't need to go in and click on the joint itself. We can select these controls and then start to control it from there. We can even give our controls colors if you desire. So I'll do so here, just with a color node. I'll put it down before the name, since the name is what determines our shape that we're using as a control. And we can color it to green or whatever we want to, and we'll see that change in our rig pose nodes. We'll be exploring more of this control setup and the rig pose as we create our character rig. The rig pose has a lot to it that can allow us to hide geometry and other aspects so that we can hide controls from certain chains or certain joints, and we'll explore that as we set it up with our character. For now though, this is just a nice introduction to the concept of control geometry. Okay, let's start exploring constraints and the rig bop a lot more in depth now. The rig attribute bot a lot more in depth. And we'll also talk about local and world transform data for these points. So let's start by setting up a new kind of system where we will explore the packed geo real quick. Let's just put down a point with an add sob, and we'll turn it into a joint with our rig doctor. Initialize transforms. We'll put down a rubber toy. This will be our geometry to explore transforms and constraints. And we'll do a capture packed geometry real quick. Get some errors, which is fine. We'll put in our rubber toy as our skin geometry, and our rig doctor, which is now our joint, our skeleton, as our skeleton. We'll add a new skinning. We'll select that joint. The capture pack geo seems to be a little bit funky right now, which is fine. It still works in a way. Put down our bone deform, and we can hook up all of our joint chains, and we can even put a rig pose real quick in here for our deform path. We're getting a little bit of an error here for our capture because of that weirdness we were experiencing with the packed geometry. Let's select pack inputs because we didn't have a packed geometry, and now we should be able to have a good solve there. There we go. And now we can control that rubber toy with our joint there. Perfect. So let's start to explore constraints simply by putting down a different joint here. We'll put down a new joint that is a little bit behind our first joint, just back there. And we'll also turn it into a joint with our rig doctor. And here I'm just going to put down a null just to separate out some things. And we'll call these our constrainers. Now let's put down a rig VOP. And we'll input our, I'm actually going to just put our rig pose over here. And we'll just put our deformer path through our VOP and our constrainers into our second input. Now let's start to explore that section of getting and setting point transforms that we had started on when we first opened our VOP the first time when we started to explore kinematics. So we're just clicking on these points interactively in our VOP, and when we click on them, if there's multiple for that point, such as our first input, it gives us our input point and our output point. As we can see, when we drag on the second option, we get a get transform. So that's our input point, and if we drag on our second input, we get a set transform. That's our output point. And we're going to grab our point 0 from our second input, and we can grab our point 0 from our first input as well. To make this cleaner, we could also have named our joints other than using the rig doctor. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that real quick. I'm going to name, I'm going to not initialize missing names here. I'm going to name our one joint constraint joint, just so we have an easier time down the line here. We'll now need to fix our get point transform. for our second endpoint, because we no longer have that naming of point 0. Okay, so Houdini just crashed on me, and sometimes that just happens. I've noticed it happening a lot with Houdini 19 when we're interactively selecting points in the viewport through any means with just KineFX pipelines in general. So just be careful with that. Make sure you save your work. Anyhow, back to our point transform. As we'll notice, we now have a different name, so our point 0 isn't going to work for grabbing that point from our second input anymore. We could just replace it, or I could just drag it on and it comes through with our name. So a few things that we can explore is simply these X forms and local X forms for our from our point transforms themselves. So when we put in our X form just directly into our set point transform, as such, we'll notice that our rubber toy gets snapped back to our constrainer point. This is just matching our joint from our main chain, our rubber toy chain, directly to our joint of our constrained chain in a world space fully. So there's no difference between the joints effectively after the fact of our constrain exploration of our rig bop here. So this would be similar to, in Maya, applying a parent constraint without maintaining offset. Alright, let's reset that point back to 0. Don't need this guy anymore. So that's what happens if we hook up our X form, just our world space X form. If we hook up our local X form, we kind of get a similar situation. Our spaces collide again because the local X form for our 0, if we just put down, reorganized our thing there. If we put down a skeleton here, and I'm not sure what I did to the viewport there. There we go. To explain and explore local transforms further, let's put down a few joints with the skeleton node. Just 2. And we'll go into modify real quick, and we can start to select these different joints. When we pull up that P menu from earlier, we can see our local transform data and our regular transform data. We can see that the child of our parent, and we'll just, for simplicity's sake, put our parent joint at 0, so that our local transform is at 0 as well. We can see that our child point has local transform data, and our parent point, it could as well, but that the local transform data of our parent point matches exactly with the world transform data, whereas it's not so with our child point. If we set our child's local transform data to 0, we'll see that it matches our point, our parent point exactly. There's no difference between our parent point and our child point. We can also notice that our, if we turn on orientation real quick, join axes, our Z defaultly points down the chain towards our child point for our skeletons. We can move that around, and it was based on our initial creation of that joint. And we can see that default, the Z-axis points towards its parent. So our skeleton creation node tries to orient our joints in a logical way that we might want. As we change around the local transform data, just in this node here, we'll do it much smaller, we can see that it is in correlation to that orientation. As we move this back and forth in the Z axis, it kind of follows along with our orientation, but seemingly as if it's going with the X axis instead of our Z axis. We can see the same effect here with moving our, I was mistaken, the XYZ, my bad. We are moving exactly in correlation with that orientation of our parent data. And if we move in world space, we're just moving in world space logically back and forth, left and right with that world space. Just as such. So if we were to hook in a new skeleton real quick, and we were to grab those joints from our constraints, which when we plug in a skeleton into a skeleton node, all it does is kind of copies a template of it. As we can see, we now have that named skeleton, and even though we severed the connection, it's still there. If we pull up our point data there, our local transform is exactly the same as our world transform. And if we were to see the skeleton of our main chain here, when we do so, since this is our parent joint for both chains, we're effectively not changing much between hooking up our local X form and our world X form. Those are the kind of important things to know for X form and local X form and constraints for the time being. We'll explore this a lot as we enter in more complex solutions to our rigging problems. But for now, we'll move on to an actual constraint node, which if we just look up constraint, we have only two constraints in Kinematic. We have a parent constraint and a look at constraint. Our parent constraint allows us to do a similar thing to inputting our X form directly. As we can see there, we snapped directly. However, if we wanted an offset, we could click this update offset. So I initially set up this constraint wrong really quick. I forgot that there was a second input we need. Obviously, a parent constraint needs a new parent, which I totally forgot to hook up, just in light of connecting things directly. We actually want to take our X form of our point that we want to constrain instead of our constrainer point, and our constrainer point becomes our new parent. And now when we collect the update offset, we can see that that offset is updated instead of just snapping right to it. Of course, if we don't want that offset, we can clear the offset and we have that exact same kind of one-to-one ratio that we had just been doing without the parent constraint. So let's use that update offset. And now when we control our constrained point, we can see that that is exactly maintaining its distance from our point initially, as we can see here. Perfect. Now, there is another way to approach this that perhaps maybe we don't want to use a constraint because maybe our offset is changing before we can update it, and we can't update it every frame or so. We'll encounter this issue when we try and put a weapon into our character's hand later in the course. How do we solve if we don't know where our constrained object is going to be? For instance, our constrained object for a gun would be its hand. If we're moving the hand of our character, how do we always update that offset from our weapon, our rubber toy? Well, we don't have to use this parent constraint necessarily. There's a workaround that we can do that allows us to be able to change however often we want to, always be updating this, and then go into constraining our object later. Let me just reset this real quick. The way we're going to do that is not with the VOP at all, actually. We're going to use a parent node. So if we want to be able to move this joint, say over to here, and then we want it to be able to constrain this so that later on down the chain, when we start moving it, as so, up here we want to be able to position our constrainer joint. Then somewhere in between these two things, we then want this to move this joint. Well, we can put in a merge node up here, and we can merge our two chains so that now we have both joints in one place. We could put down a parent node, and we can say this should become our parent to that. And we can see immediately that once we start to move this constrained object and we look at that parent, we can see that that's updated however we need it to be. Now when we move this parent over into our new rig pose down the line, when we move our parent joint, when we move that parent joint, we're moving our point 0 as well. To get it back into the chain, we need that skeleton blend node. We're just going to put it after this VOP here that we've been skipping. And we'll do a world space change. And we want to make sure we're changing towards our right side there. Perfect. I'm actually going to just, for clarity reasons, skip the VOP entirely. We're taking our pre-chain, merging it with our control chain, setting up a parent system, which is, I mean, it's called a parent constraint, so it's very similar kind of thought process. But we're just setting up a parent in total. And then we can repose wherever that parent is before we parent, and then change how we want to move it. And then we blend that joint back in, and we can see a similar result. But like I said, we can always move where our parent joint is initially, and then have it reset up as such, which is helpful for when we are, like I said, trying to position a weapon at a certain point, but that point keeps moving, which would mean we'd always have to keep updating this offset every frame, which isn't really viable. So there's this method to kind of creating a custom constraint as well. So that's been a good brief introduction into constraints. We'll explore it a lot more in depth as we need to approach these problems to solve. For now, we're going to hop back into our tube chain of things. So we've taken a look quickly at the parent constraint here, and we've talked about world space. Let's explore another constraint, that second constraint we saw when we looked up constraint, the look at constraint. When we put it down, we see that it's not too dissimilar from our parent constraint. It just has a few more options here, and we've got some different inputs. So firstly, we want that x form for our point that we want to manipulate, which is our point 0 again, and our look at point, which is going to be our constraint object. And another very helpful input, depending on what we're doing, is a look up, which can be a point above either our constraint object or right above our other point, that can help us maintain a good orientation for our constraint. And we'll see here in a second what I mean, I bet, when I plug this in. So currently our axes are kind of lined up in a way that's well with our rubber toy, aiming down the z-axis with y up, which is good. When we move this around, similar to how we had to reorient some of our axes with our IK solvers, we have to do so with our aim constraint as well. And right now the aim constraint is working very well, and as we can see here, it's a pretty simple concept. The point that we are constraining does its best to orient the axis that we determined as our look at axis as best towards our point as possible that we are constrained to. Very helpful. Sometimes to keep a better orientation, or if we need a better orientation, we can off-split our main chain here. So I'm just going to grab a rig pose here to split off our main chain and put it into our third chain here. And we can take this rig pose, and I'm going to show us how we can just use this up chain to flip our rubber toy around here. I'm going to take that point that we just produced, our third input point, and I'm going to put that into our look up. So now our y-axis is up, which is good, and it'll do its best to consider wherever this point is as y up. So it'll try and orient our y-axis towards this point, and it'll try and aim our z-axis towards our aim point. This is useful for if our axis isn't oriented properly. We got lucky with how it was oriented, but say our rubber toy was defaultly upside down just because that's how it interpreted. We can use this point to help us orient our rubber toy how is needed, or our joint how is needed for our cases. It's very helpful, and that's kind of a quick breakdown of our look at constraint. I rarely use the offset for the look at, but you can create an offset just like we could for the parent constraint. And the blend option is available to us by default as well, which just lets us blend between no constraint and the constraint completely on as well. We can see that the blend parameter is available on our parent constraint as well, and we can do so with that and even promote it if we want to. So we're going to explore one more cool kind of constraint before moving on, which is a constraint that allows us to move joints along a path. So here I've created a curve just by placing things down in the scene, and I'm going to put it into a rig doctor node to initialize some name transforms, or sorry, some names. And we're going to put that into our second input for our VOP instead of our constraint points. When we dive in, we're going to want to make sure we have our set point transform to our point 0. And we're going to create a transform from path. And we'll give it a second to think. There we go. So we have a transform from path, and we have it in our second input. And instead of inputting our constraint data, we're just going to input our out form from our curve into our x form for our point. And we can see now that we get that that snap to our curve already. And if we click on our transform from path, we can edit these parameters a bit to see it move along the path if we want to. And if we wanted to orient towards our path as well, we can change our look at offset to be just slightly more than 0. What the look at offset is it points towards a position on the curve. As we can see, the offset is now at 0.3-ish. He's looking at around this point on the curve, and as we go along the curve, he'll look that far ahead on the curve as well. So a minimal offset will mean he's looking right in front of him as we go along the curve. Perfect. And of course you can promote these parameters if you want to see them on the SOP level, or whatever you would like to do with that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of good starting ground for KineFX. We've covered joint creation for several different methods, some constraint methods, some kinematic setups, some VOPs. Now I want you to, for the assignment for this week, I want you to explore all these aspects and try and build a spring rig out of what we've covered, and try and make it so that it can kind of bounce like a spring would down a stairs, where you can see it level with the planes at either end. And I'll give you a hint for skinning our spring is that we can skin a tube with a capture weight exactly like that, and then we can transfer our attributes to our spring that we set up and even lay down a new capture weight zone here and continue editing our paint regions as we need to. So try your best. Maybe you find a way to use that path constraint that we had to control your control geometry so it springs along a path. Maybe you find a way to reconstruct parents as such so that when we are orienting our joints, we get that orientation on either end to follow flat with the surface that we're on. Maybe you find a new solution. Do your best and explore. Don't feel afraid to reach out and ask questions.